it looks like we're winning, winning, winning. So that's what it's going to be about today. I got a plan to just get rid of all this Canada stuff and just move forward for everybody. And that's what the show is about. It's about moving forward. It's about relationships. That's why we call it the breakup. It's about ending one relationship with one kind of money, starting one with another, right? We all love money. This isn't a show about how we value money necessarily. It's a show about the relationship we have with money. And we try to contrast that relationship for the US dollar and for Bitcoin. Today gives us just a perfect example, because as a Bitcoiner, before I was a Bitcoiner, I was a Canadian. And it looks like there's trouble in my country. And a lot of people are worried, oh, they're doing the War Measures Act. I'm going to talk about today how that's probably a big mistake on their end, how it might even usher in hyper-Bitcoinization really soon. And I'm going to share a plan on how we can use George Soros's tricks against the Bank of Canada and exactly what that would look like and what position we're in. So is it even realistic and can we do it? So we'll get there. But before Bitcoin and all that stuff, as I said, I was a Canadian. And not only was I a Canadian, I was kind of a lawyer. I wouldn't say I'm exactly a lawyer. I went through law school. I worked for a law firm in Japan. I did all that. You know, I almost articled at the federal court, but had one of the worst interviews a human being has ever had. I describe it as playing tag with the two judges on me, with the two fastest runners I ever met, and they just didn't, want to play fair. But anyway, it all worked out because I went to the Senate, learned about FinTrack and FinCEN and all these laws we're talking about today, and then got them to do the Bitcoin study, which is how I ended up here all those years ago. Been working in Bitcoin for a long time now. So I am familiar with the legal system. So I'll briefly describe the legal aspects of what's going on in Canada, because I think it's helpful for everyone, because Bitcoin plays a center role in what's going on, and I'll explain that. So originally, the main courts in black here, the Court of Ontario, the Superior Court of Ontario, which is sort of the highest court. There's an appeals court, but it isn't necessarily considered higher because it's only appeals on law. It's not like retry a case or anything like that. It's not that kind of appeals court. So the Superior Court are the courts that the states themselves, the provinces in Canada, have most of their interest in. It works for their legal system. So Quebec has its own legal system. So this is all not as important, but just to let you know. So Ontario in the American sense would be like California and Texas, right? It's like two huge states together in its proportion of the entire country. So think about that in its context. So this court is quite important. In the original judgment, and you hear this a lot, illegal protests you might hear in mainstream media, they're not illegal. The protests themselves are not illegal. One piece of the protests are illegal. So you'll hear that a lot. It's the honking. A judge, Hugh McLean, in the Superior Court of Ontario in the early days of the trucker protest, said that it's a fine protest. As long as they're not violent, I can't see anything wrong with this protest. However, the noise is a real issue. You're hurting people and you have to stop it. He gave a 10-day injunction just against the honking of horns, right? So the honking of horns is illegal. Protesting in front of Parliament, legal. The other one that gets confused with illegal is the Ambassador Bridge to Detroit. That was the one that was blocked. The difference here is the Ambassador Bridge is private property. So because it's private property, it was technically illegal because the protest on the bridge itself was removed by American trucks, American tow trucks. They could, it's private property. So that was definitely illegal. What was going on the land on the other side in the city of Windsor, totally not illegal, right? So that could be confused. Now, Canada is not like Washington, DC. Ottawa is just a city in Ontario. It would be like if Washington, DC was just a city in Maryland or Virginia, right? There is no special district of Ottawa, it's Ottawa. And so that's why the Ontario Supreme Court was important here. The provincial court said no honking, but the protests are fine, right? No honking, but the protests are fine. Then what we call the premier, the prime minister, premier, the governor of the state, Doug Ford, he was the Rob Ford with the crack, it's his brother. So the guy, the Doug Ford guy was a big surprise because most people thought he was a populist, said on Friday that we're going to take the money. Right, we're gonna take money from the protests. So you have the Ontario court saying no honking and no giving money. The no giving money piece probably would have been fought in court because it was probably unconstitutional. I'm not going to say for sure, but it didn't look like it was going to fly. In comes the federal government on yesterday with the emergency powers. Some people used to call it the War Measures Act, but they changed the name in the 1980s, Emergency Powers Act, but it's the same law, it's the same effect. Now, what that ended up doing was going into this provincial piece about the no money. And what I said was it being dangerous and probably wouldn't pass. Well, that's why they went and did it. Now, the way that works is the emergency powers require a threshold that's beyond the province, beyond the state limit. So if a state itself can't handle the problem, the federal government can come and do it, but there's a threshold there. So the scale of the protest has to be national, or at least in so many states that that each individual state couldn't handle it. So there's a scale and severity test. So it's a sort of threshold, right? Do the states or provinces have enough tools in their toolbox to deal with this? What they said here is because they couldn't actually take the money here, right? Remember I said they probably couldn't take the money? They had to invoke this because they're saying the powers didn't exist here, okay? So emergency powers enacted. The thing about the emergency powers is the federal cabinet, so the executive branch in the US system, they have the unilateral ability to declare this, right? They can declare it, just declare it. Okay, so that's what they did. The threshold still matters, however. The threshold piece still matters, and that's why you already have a couple of Canadian provinces that have come out and said you didn't pass the threshold. We have the powers to deal with this. Alberta, that had its own border crossing trouble at Coutts on the border with the United States in Alberta, said, no, we can deal with this. We don't need the federal powers. We don't need to get into their banking and all the rest of it. The province of Quebec, where I'm from, said, no way, Jose, this is not happening. Terrible. We don't want this emergency powers law. We're not into it. So a few states have already said that. So that already is an issue. They can declare it, but the states do not have any ratifying power, but they can at least explain and complain and say, no way, no way. Now, the ratification or the full issuance of this power still has some hoops to jump through. The first here is parliamentary review. So that means both the House and the Senate have to come within 7 days of yesterday. So they have till next Monday to confirm this. And they both have to vote to confirm. If one House says no, it's over, right? So that's another threshold that has to be passed. So that's where you're going to get a lot of this, not beyond the provinces. We could have handled it. You didn't need to do this. The powers exist. Don't worry, right? That's where you're hearing all that stuff. We could have handled this. So that'll all get replayed here again. There's another one called the judicial review, right? So the courts can also look over this. The first one would just be administrative review. That's where we're getting back into this. Is this beyond the provinces, right? Did they really need to do this? So that's where you actually need a court to say, well, were the powers there or weren't they, right? Were the powers there or weren't they? And then finally, you have to make a constitutional review. And the constitutional review is a section 1 test called the Oakes test. Oakes test is really just, is this justified in a free and fair society? Is it reasonable? And the Oakes test was it's really easy to understand. So before the charter, if you had possession of drugs, you would be charged for possession. And the separate charge of intent to sell was just de facto. You had it, they could just charge you for intent to sell. Possession meant intent to sell. There was no distinction between the two, right? So if you were caught with an ounce of pot, they could declare you that you had the intention to sell, and that would just be that. So what they did was they used the charter pretty much right when it came out. It only came out in the 80s, and said, let's do a section 1 test on this. And see if this abridgment of my rights makes sense, because intent is that's the whole point of criminal law. You have to prove intent. You're guilty until proven innocent. So what they did was they proved that, of course, he had the 1 ounce of whatever drug, but they could not establish, or they didn't even bother establishing that he had intent, but now had to prove his intent. So the section 1 took this piece of the criminal code away, right? But the intention is really important there. So in the end, it was not reasonable. Right, the whole logic of it was not reasonable to infringe on this one individual's rights because it didn't really pose a threat to the country. The idea that there was a couple of drug dealers out there and we couldn't tell how much or what was going on wasn't really a big deal. So they said this is a charter issue. If this was a national problem, there were drug dealers all over the place, it's a different story, right? If it was like a zombie apocalypse of drug dealers that were all dealing, small amounts, then it would be an issue. But the way it was not. So that little piece there is really important. And it's my bet that it won't pass there. It's my bet it's going to have a lot of trouble here, and then definitely here. So I think he's going to get a few days of this, but my prediction is it ain't going to last. And the sweeping powers, especially those concerned with Bitcoin, right? Because the whole point was the money, right? You're not going to see, they call it the War Measures Act. You're not going to see a tank. You're not going to see helicopters on the street. It was all about the Bitcoin. literally all about the Bitcoin, because the powers didn't exist. So I can see why they'd have a bit of an argument here and in Min, but not really, because it's not so much the transmission of Bitcoin, it's the person who has it and what's going on. So all this to say, my prediction is, don't think they're out of the woods. Still think this is the end of Trudeau. I don't think he can survive this. Maybe not even the week. We'll see. But things are ticking, and I'm not so worried about the government side of this. I think it's really pushed the sticks and advanced the cause in the opposite direction, because what has to happen next for this to get confirmed is quite a bit, actually. Now, that brings up a great point. I have, for many years now, been considering, if the hyper Bitcoinization scenario plays out, eventually there's a heavyweight title between the US dollar, the current reserve currency, and Bitcoin. And they punch each other out. And we all have imagined Bitcoin walks away the heavyweight champion of money. But you need a couple title fights. You need a couple warm-ups. You need to get some practice before you take on the scariest money alive. I always thought the Canadian dollar was just the right amount of practice. Canada is in every way 1/10 the population, 1/10 the economy. You can see that 1/10 of the United States in a lot of different ways. Even in QE, the QE in the United States, 7 trillion. I think in Canada it was 500 or 600 billion. It was kind of the 1/10 thing again, right? It was always that repetition of 1/10, 30-something million people versus 300-something million people. So right away, it's already a pretty nice size to get going. Practice your left hook, practice your right hook, practice your short, practice your long, right? And it looked like that. But I wondered, I'd heard about George Soros running his breaking the Bank of England, but what did it cost? I don't know any of the numbers, right? It happened a long time ago. It happened in the 1990s. And I wondered, what would it cost to attack the Bank of Canada? And can we do it? Are we big enough now? I think we are. I think we can do it. Let me show you. So in the 1990s, if you don't know what George Soros did, let me explain it real quick. So in the 1990s, when they were creating the euro, they did something called I just want to get it right here, the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, the ERM. And the European Exchange Rate Mechanism kept the money that was going to sync together at a even enough or predictable enough exchange rate. But that limited the ability to move interest rates, because we know that interest rates, right, can affect the interest people have in the money and whether they want it or not, and whether there's a demand for it and what they're going to do with it, right? How much it costs to borrow, all those things. George Soros took a look and said, well, their interest rates are really high. They're like 13 or 14% in the UK. He said, I don't think they can raise them anymore. And it looks like they have a bit of trouble with recession coming. So I think if I just borrow money from them, I can sell it for German Deutschmarks, because they were bound, right? They were bound, they were tied together. And his bet was, if he put enough money in, that eventually it would have to break and that the pound would sink. So that's what he did. In the end, it only took about 10 billion pounds on his end to amass his position. A few others followed. And in one day, when it happened, when they made the move, when they started liquidating all this stuff, when the short was squeezed, it cost the Bank of England all the reserves. They ran out. That's why it ended. They ran out of money to fight the fire. It cost them 27 billion pounds. They started in the morning with 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. They raised interest rates 5% in one day. 5% raising of rates, and a $27 billion war chest burned to the ground, and they had to capitulate. They gave up, right? They gave up. That was all the money they had to do the fight, right? That was everything they had. Now let's look at Canada. So that's the way you do it, right? You borrow money in one, right? We've heard Michael Saylor talk about it. That's the great thing about us Bitcoiners, and even the shitcoiners, right? The shitcoiners in one of these things, you can think of them. Remember the Lord of the Rings when that ghost army comes in, when Aragorn, if you haven't seen it, Aragorn has to go and get like ghosts and then bring them to fight in the last battle in front of the Pelennor Fields, I guess it was called. And they run it with all these ghosts. Those are like these shitcoiners, man. If they come around and start partying, because they learned how to short, they know what a squeeze is, they can get involved if they see money, right? So what you have to imagine is that if it costs $27 billion, because that's what they had, what would it cost to sink the Canadian dollar? What kind of cash do they have? Well, it turns out They've got about 56 billion US dollars. They have 0 gold. They were too clever for that. They got rid of it. They thought it was dumb, old-fashioned tech. So that's gone. So they've got 50 billion US dollars. That's it. That's what they got to fight. Their whole QE program, 2 billion a week, was to buy Canadian bonds. They're the only buyer. They bought all of it, right? And then 2 billion a week. So they've been spending 2 billion a week so they can afford 2 billion a week, right? They've wound that down as of last autumn, but it's 2 billion a week. Interest rates are 0.25%, the policy rate, the overnight rate, 0.25. It's non-existent, right? So you can borrow from them at 0.25. They've only got about the same. 27 billion is only 46 billion Canadian dollars or something like that. So there's a big, big avenue there for Bitcoiners to mount an attack. What would it take? If Bitcoin exchanges got together and say offered a deal on Canadian dollars, right? There's a fire sale on Canadian dollars, right? You would attract enough interest from around the world, I think, to get the ball rolling. And if it only costs $50 billion, I think we can get it together. Might not be today, might not be tomorrow. We could probably try it today, right? We could probably try it today, but it would only cost $50 billion. And then, of course, the two scenarios happen, right? You borrow, you buy. Either they can fight it or they run out of reserves. And as I said, they've only got 50 billion US tokens on hand to fight this fire. Can we come up with 50 billion US tokens to fight this fucking thing? Right? Can we call up the Tether guys or something? Right? Let's get on it. I think we can do it. I think we're big enough now. And we need the practice fight. We need the practice fight. If we're ever going to get in the ring with the USD, could happen in 3 years, could happen at the next election cycle. A lot is in the air right now politically and a lot of opportunities, but this is a big one. If Canada wants to be the first G7 country to step up and see if it can take on the most amazing money that ever lived, I would love to see it. I would love to see it. And I'm on the side of Canadian people here because I think they'd win with us in their corner. So that's today's episode of The Breakup. Don't trust these central banks. Don't trust the people that are pushing these policies. I'm not going to tell you what else to trust, right? I'm just going to tell you don't trust them, right? You're on your own after that. So that's it for today. Follow me at CountBTC and see you soon.